All right, so I think we're just going to have more people coming in, but we are going to get started because we've got a lot to talk about, and we definitely want to leave some time at the end for some questions and answers. Welcome to the Niskanen Center's webinar on how we need now capacity agenda for 2025. We are very lucky to be joined by our two authors who will go through some introductions. My name is Ben Bain. I'm the director for state capacity at Niskanen. And below, you should be able to see a Q&A feature. So as we go through this process, if you want to submit questions for our two authors to answer towards the end, we will do so. So I'll keep an eye on that. We also have the chat function, so don't be shy about kind of sharing thoughts and ideas and links in there. At the very beginning here, I'm just going to drop the link to a Google form. So if you want to give some feedback on the report, or if you've got some ideas or projects that you would like to that you think would be promising, or you've got some stories to share around state capacity, I will drop this again towards the end and we'll share it around after. But this would be a great way for us to be able to have some more meaningful engagement with anybody that is here today. Okay, so before we get into it, welcome. There's a lot happening right now in the United States, and then especially around all issues of state capacity. So I think this is a very well-timed webinar. In December, right before the holidays, we released the report around a capacity agenda for 2025. So that's what we're going to dig into today. And so we're going to start with introductions. So Jen, uh, how would you describe what you do today? And then after that, I'd like you to briefly walk us through kind of the set of professional experiences that led you here.
Isn't the answer to that question for everybody now? We do group chats. That's our jobs. What I do today is try to help articulate how our government might be able to better achieve its policy goals. And I came to that really sort of by continually going upstream, first looking at government technology and then the problems of service delivery, and then the problems that are upstream of that, which is sort of the ways that government sort of hobbled itself from being able to actually achieve the goals that we set out. So I work with folks in executive and legislative branches to understand what's holding us back and provide a theory of how we might move forward more quickly.
Thank you. And I mean, you've hit some, maybe most people understand your background, but you've done some pretty important things that have led you here today. So could you just walk us through some of those key moments that you've learned and experienced and why that kind of gives you your own unique perspective right now?
I got into sort of government technology, which is, as I said, sort of downstream of a lot of this, back in 2009. In 2010, founded Code for America. Did that for a couple of years where we're helping city and state governments, and then was asked to come to the White House and help build what became the United States Digital Service as the Deputy Chief Technology Officer under Obama. Ben, you and I met when we were working on the Defense Innovation Board. So I have a particular soft spot in my heart for the Pentagon and its problems with state capacity. And so learned a whole lot there. Then wrote a book called Recoding America, Why Government is Failing in the Digital Age and How We Can Do Better. And since then have decided to do this work under the banner of the Niskanen Center, which I'm just such a fan of.
It's amazing. Yeah, we are lucky to have you. So thank you for doing all of that and continuing to work on this. Now, everybody, please. The chat seems to be disabled, so we're going to take a crack at that. Thanks for everybody letting us know. So we will work on that. But everybody brace yourself because Andrew has a great accent. So Andrew, what do you do today? How do you describe what you do today? And then also kind of what's your set of experiences that led you here today?
Thanks, Ben. Way to make me feel self-conscious. Thank you so much for having me here. So I'm the co-founder of a consultancy called Public Digital, which is based in London in the UK, and we work with governments around the world, including in the US, on digital transformation and institutional reform. But I'm also a recovering public servant. I worked in the UK government for several years on various different jobs. And civil service reform and state capacity is my calling, whether I wanted it to be or not. And in terms of my background, I did various things in the UK government, but one of them was helping to set up a team called the Government Digital Service, which was done sort of around 2011, 2012. Almost uniquely at the time, that was a tech thing in government that didn't go badly. It went quite well. That meant it got noticed by various places around the world. And that's how I first encountered Jen. and she came over with others from the US to come and see what the Brits are up to and why that seemed to be working for a change. And that kind of led to various things, excitingly on this side, including USDS and others. And we kind of rekindled our connection last year, particularly off the back of a report that I wrote called The Radical How, which we'll probably talk a bit more about in a minute. And I think, Jen and I sort of share similar passions in terms of making government work better, and a conviction really that this kind of stuff that we're going to be talking about this morning should be far more front and center in the kind of political conversation than it has tended to be over the last 30, 40 years. So yeah, really looking forward to this.
Amazing. Thanks, Andrew. So Jen, coming to you first, state capacity is kind of a wonky term. There's often confusion when you bring that up. So maybe walk us through, what is state capacity? How are you defining it these days? And why is it particularly important right now?
The technical definition, or I guess the academic definition, is the ability of a government to achieve its policy goals. So it's a distinct from the fight about what those policy goals should be. We called the report the how we need now, because it's the how, not the what. And that's, a difficult thing to talk about in a moment where there is, great disagreement about the what, and in fact, great fear, I think, about the what that is going on right now. But I think another way to think about it is there's a lot of what that's in the headlines, and then there's simply the challenges that we face as a nation in this moment that we have to meet regardless of what is grabbing headlines. Government is the only entity that's big enough and democratically elected, right, to meet a lot of those challenges. Obviously, the private sector has a role, the public generally has a role, but we need an effective government to combat climate change, to deal with a sort of fracturing and very dynamic world order. We may have another pandemic on the way. Government has to be able to work to be able to meet those challenges. And if we simply always cobble it and say we're concerned about it having too much power, which both the left and the right do, we find ourselves in a position where it really isn't able to do that. So with all of, I think it's, for me, certainly the political moment makes this a difficult conversation to have, but the moment in which we have all these challenges we must face makes it a critical conversation to have.
One quick follow-up there. You mentioned the book Recoding America, which has been very popular. It's a great read if anybody hasn't read it yet. But I love the story that you talk about, where you said, I don't think you used the term state capacity there at all. And
No.
you tell the story about the kind of book that you've written, and then people tell you afterwards. Could you just walk us through like the connections of how you've made that mental transition from like the world that you were really deeply in, and then Recoding America, and now where you find yourself?
Yeah, you're referring to the fact that I never talk about state capacity in the book. Those two words are both in there, but never together. But I do, when you look at the problems of government through the eyes of the users, and then back up into what is actually going on in the bureaucracy, you start to see it, I think, from a bottoms up view. And that's sort of what I tried to bring to the table with the book, is what does this really look like? Not from a high level view of, hey, Congress is dysfunctional and we have polarization, but if you're actually trying to deliver on the goals that our political system expects us to deliver on as a bureaucracy, what happens that isn't really what we expect? Like, the dialogue, I think, on sort of both sides can be that are, can characterize the bureaucracy as sort of not doing what we intended. And I think sometimes apply a certain motivation to that. And in fact, I think a lot of the reason we don't get what we intend is not intentional. It's because the structures need updating. It's because the way our government operates is outdated, and the foundations are correct and strong, and we should absolutely support them. But what we've built on top of those foundations desperately needs renovation.
And Andrew, you've written significantly about this as well. So I'd like to ask you about the report that you wrote, The Radical How, with Public Digital. So maybe tell us about what inspired that, what's come of it, And particularly, what can our US audience learn from what you've been experiencing in the UK, progress and challenges?
Yeah, so the Radical How was written in the run-up to the election that we had in the UK last year, and 2024 was clearly a year of elections. We were in the relatively fortunate position in the UK in that we were pretty sure who would win. Change of administration was coming, and it would be the first sort of significant change in government at the UK for 14 years. In their kind of preparing for government and their manifesto, the new Labour administration set out some quite clear missions. So 5 sort of headline things that it was trying to do. So very much the what, really. And all of those were quite big, difficult system level goals around economic growth and safer streets and so on. And so we wanted to take a look at, okay, well, these are quite significant challenges that they're trying to pick up and run with. What would they need for successful delivery of those things? And we look back at a bunch of the sort of successful interventions and less successful interventions in the UK over the last 20, 25 years. And we kind of found some pretty consistent patterns. So one that Jen's already talked about, which is government focusing on the how as much as the what was absolutely crucial in terms of getting to successful outcomes. But we also found that quite a lot of the more successful things that had happened in the UK, so for example, putting together a task force that led to kind of COVID vaccines, delivering the London Olympic Games in 2012, there were lots of similar characteristics that those kind of efforts shared. They had multidisciplinary teams. They were really, really intently focused on outcomes. They applied these sort of test and learn approaches with rapid feedback loops, which we talk a lot about in the report. So there were these sort of common patterns and common root causes to the good, as well as the sort of the flip side of the coin to the things that didn't work. But the other thing that came through really strongly was those successes were exceptions. Like they weren't the norm. And they were things that were happening kind of despite the system and despite the incentives that were acting on both public servants and contractors and companies, not because of them. So we published the Radical How in spring. New government took office in July. So it's still pretty early days in the UK. We're still, sort of 6 months or so into the new administration, and we're all very impatient, as you'd expect. But there are some positive signals that are coming out of the new government. So just before Christmas, a quite senior minister made a speech where, among other things around kind of the need for reform of the state, he was saying things like, it's not about us getting things right first time, it's about building a machine that can make things better by next Friday. Like that idea of the tighter feedback loops and that test and learn approach is coming through much more strongly from the top levels of government than I've really seen before. He also announced a fairly substantial fund for setting up a bunch of new test and learn teams. So this stuff wasn't just about the rhetoric. It was actually, okay, we're going to try some stuff. We're going to experiment with some things and test these new methodologies at scale for real. And actually this week, the national auditor came out and said that he wants to put in place a sort of scrutiny framework. So, the kind of the core accountability framework, if you like, for big government programs here. And he uses phrases like, the value for money requires well-managed risk-taking. Now, there's an auditor saying that. I kind of double underline that. The auditor is saying things like, we need to develop a culture of fast learning and adaptation. So when you sort of start to see those sort of almost external voices acting upon the bureaucracy, those are kind of, I think, causes for optimism and causes for hope. And I mean, it applies to the US. Very, very conscious. We'll clearly get into some of the kind of the activities post-inauguration later. And it is really important to say that, the UK and the US are different. They've got different political cultures. There are different kind of structures and institutions and so on. But I think there are two kind of pretty transferable headlines right across the world, because I think state capacity is a general challenge for kind of developing economies and developed economies. One is acknowledge that the status quo isn't working. It's just not working often enough. And when it is working, it's kind of doing so by accident because of some genuinely heroic efforts, actually, by quite a lot of incredible public servants. But that is not happening by default. And I think the sort of the second headline is to sweat the backstage stuff. The report that Jen and I have written, is talking about some relatively niche topics, niche at least to normal people, like talking to friends of my parents, like what procurement is exactly. But personnel, procurement, funding, governance, that is where the boring magic happens, is the truth. And bringing that more front and center is one of the things that I'm hopeful is happening a little bit more, at least in the UK now.
Thank you. Yeah, we're definitely we're going to follow up a little bit more on how you see some of the opportunities and challenges that are similar across the pond, but also different. But first, I'd like to come back to just the fact that both of y'all are excellent storytellers in your writing, and you understand the value of being able to tell a really good story in order to kind of get over maybe some fairly wonkier, in the details, in the weeds ideas. So, Andrew, maybe you could start us off with a positive story when things go right in government, and then what are the impacts, and like how does that really impact, real people, like every day on the streets? What does that look like to you?
Yeah, I mean, so I should confess, I'm a much better storyteller in written form than verbal. Like I could never do stand up. But let's have a go. So the classic story from the UK in the last sort of 10 years or so is a program or a policy called Universal Credit. And one of the things I think makes Universal Credit a really good story is that it kind of follows that textbook three-act structure, like any good superhero film, it follows that. So here's a bit of creative writing 101. So you start with the setup, obviously. So Universal Credit, biggest welfare reform in the UK for 60 years, sort of since the creation of the welfare state back in 1948. It basically effectively was about combining 6 working age benefits into a single payment. So it was a pretty profound change to the kind of the structure of welfare entitlements at a national level. It was the flagship social policy of the administration. Oh, I've just seen someone in the chat. It's quite hard to hear. Is that
I'm hearing you pretty well. Jen, can you hear me?
okay?
I can hear him fine. Yeah.
Okay,
Sorry.
sorry, Tom. I'll keep going. I hope it sort of improves. So yeah, you see flagship social policy of the administration, big deal, big deal. So that's Act 1. Act 2, the confrontation. So after 3 years of universal credit, which was set up as a sort of very traditional program, they'd spent $500 million by that stage, and they'd followed the classic pattern of big government programs. So they sort of started off with the minister saying, I want something called universal credit. That was turned into a long policy document, lots of rules and kind of legalistic kind of bits and pieces. That was then turned into a long list of requirements for a technology system. That list of requirements was chucked over the wall to a bunch of outsourcers, big suppliers, big vendors. You can guess the names. They're pretty similar in the UK and the US. But after 3 years, universal credit wasn't a thing other than a big pile of paper. No one had used it. No frontline worker had been anywhere near it. There was no service to speak of, and it was just sort of heading for the rocks. And that wasn't because the sort of officials and the companies involved were being sort of intentionally malign or incompetent, for the most part. They were kind of following the orthodoxy of how you manage big projects in government, and it was all going wrong. And they called in, the government has a sort of UK government has an external reviewer team. They came in. Normally they give red, amber, green to major projects. They gave universal credit a black. I don't think anyone's done that since. So that kind of gives you a sense where you're at. So classic end of Act 2, everything looks pretty grim. Act 3, the resolution, universal credit gets reset, started again with a small team in an entirely different building, actually. And they started not by kind of going back and writing some different policy. They built a lo-fi end-to-end prototype and started testing that with really quite a small number of people, like 100 households. So a very kind of small area of London. And tested that service with real people in a real scenario. And then they learned stuff. They learned stuff that their assumptions were incorrect or needed to be changed. And they changed it and they adapted the service. And then they tested it again and adapted it again and tested it again with progressively larger populations over time. And they were testing different things at each stage. Initially about the kind of core proposition of the service, like what's the fundamentals? And then it would be, well, how do you scale this across different frontline offices and so on? So the assumptions would change, but the scaling continued. We're not talking pilots, that incremental scaling. And then sort of as the credits roll, like what was the impact of all of this? Well, during COVID, Universal Credit saw a 12 times increase in the demand on that service, pretty much overnight. A lot more people were relying on the government for payments. It was fine. It handled it. It didn't fall over. But almost more significantly in a way, the other thing that happened during those kind of first few months of the pandemic was there were policy changes incredibly, like on a weekly basis, because, who was entitled to stuff and what they were entitled to, the government needed to kind of turn on the dime quite quickly. And a national scale service was able to make those policy change the entire operation of this national service on a kind of daily basis, maybe 3 times a week. And there's no way that kind of linear programmatic structure would have allowed them to do that. So all of that to say, universal credit isn't universally popular. There are still people who will disagree about the policy decisions and how much money gets given to people or some of the rules involved, but it works. Over 6 million people get paid every month universal credit in the UK. So that's what, 10% of Britain every month. And the kind of the key thing about that story for me, if you like, is it wasn't just at the reset where people advocated for those kind of techniques around test and learn and multidisciplinary teams. There were people from the outside saying, oh no, well, we should do that the first time. But they were kind of written off as that's sort of innovation stuff. This is real things. This is big government. We need to do this properly, do it by the rule book. And if universal credit, I think, exemplifies anything, it's that those techniques that are often written off as the kind of the kids in t-shirt stuff can be applied to the absolutely core biggest problems of government and to improve delivery of them substantially.
I'll just chime in and say, I mean, the obvious parallel to the US when you see universal credit serving 12 times as many people in the beginning of the pandemic is our unemployment insurance systems administered at the state level, which were not fine. They were not fine at all. And people really suffered from applying for unemployment insurance in the beginning of the pandemic and finding out months later that they were still waiting for their benefit and running out of money and really in dire circumstances. And you can see now, I think, why I wanted Andrew to collaborate on this, because we certainly have good examples in the US too. And I talked about some of them in my book. In fact, one of the reasons I loved the universal credit story is it seemed like it had a lot in common with the story I told in Recoding America about the rollout of a law called MACRA, Medicare Access Chip Reauthorization Act, where the team did find a way somehow to do some of what the universal credit team did. But, they weren't doing it in an environment where that was supposed to be the norm. They were fighting to do that at every turn. And I get a lot of people coming to me saying, oh, we have a great agile development project, and I want you to tell the story of my agile development project. And I want to hear them. I really love hearing from people about what they consider to be successes. But if you're doing agile software development in a fundamentally waterfall environment, you are fighting the whole time, and you are not really getting the benefit that universal credit was able to get. You're not really going to get that scalability, the reliability, all of the things that really build trust and faith with the public. Like, we broke trust and faith with the public when we couldn't deliver unemployment insurance benefits. And you can't just say, oh, we're employing agile software development methodologies. It has to be far more fundamental than that. And that's where we want to push the conversation. And it's bigger than that. I don't mean that's the whole point of the report, but I really do want people to challenge just the orthodoxy that if you apply a new software development framework to these challenges, you're going to get better outcomes. You're going to get slightly better outcomes. We need dramatically better outcomes.
It's agreed, and it's so important to be able to share the positive stories. I get a chuckle kind of every time, or oftentimes I'll say like, hey, I'm working with Jen Pahlka. They're like, oh yeah, Recoding America. I love that book. It made me want to, bash my head up against the wall because of all these functions, there's all these bad stories, but there's actually some really good stories there too. And I think we need to continue to be able to tell the positive stories.
You just have to get to chapter 10.
Yeah. So, I'll skip over the dysfunctions. One of my favorite parts of the report that y'all wrote is part 2, which brings together, all the different ways that sometimes government just doesn't quite deliver to the intent. And so, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this webinar, but I definitely encourage people to read that. It's a great, y'all offer the right vocabulary, the right frame for people to be able to connect with and talk about some of these challenges. But I'd love to talk about the priority areas that y'all have identified. So in the report, well, first off, so many things can fit under the broader state capacity umbrella, but you had to choose. So you had to prioritize, which is good practice for all the things that y'all have been talking about. And you chose 4 priority areas. So number 1, hire the right people and fire the wrong ones. So kind of some particular priorities within this broader sense of public service reform or civil service reform. Number 2 is reduce procedural bloat. Number 3 is invest in data and digital infrastructure. And number 4 is close the policy implementation loop. It's this feedback loop around outcomes. And so, Jen, maybe I'll start with you and, why these 4? Like, what do you mean by these 4 and why did you choose these 4 versus any other way that you could organize, state capacity challenges?
The first two really go together. I mean, they all go together, but the first two really go together in the sense that it's an incredibly simple observation, which is you can either have more people or less for them to do. And sort of different parties or ideologies is sort of attached onto either of those at times. And I don't think it's one or the other, right? Like, you have to have the people who can do the job. Right now, we have a system that is very poorly suited to getting people in the door, both as quickly as we need and with the proper assessments of them, and managing those teams. And so without that, you're not really going to be able to have the right people. But if you just say, oh, we need more people, and you don't look at the nature of the work that they're doing, and say how much of this work is actually focused on getting the outcome that the American people want and deserve and need versus the sort of meeting what the public digital team used to call government needs, right? This is back in 2011, I believe, the GDS team published a document that started out with, said first principle was start with needs, and it had this little asterisk in this very cheeky way. And below, if you looked at the asterisk, it said user needs, not government needs. It's not that government needs are not valid. A lot of them are there for very good reasons. We must be thoughtful about them, but it's sort of that analogy of like, if those are the big, if you fill the whole vase or whatever with all of the little government needs, there's no room for the big thing, which is meeting the needs of the users. And we've got to do it the other way. We've got to put the user needs in first. And so the language we use, which again is oversimplified, very oversimplified and sort of second grade language, but you've got a lot of stop energy, and we need to increase the amount of go energy when you're looking at the people and the roles that they have in government. If you're going to reduce that stop energy, all of the ways in which we say you've got a team who's supposed to get something done, but you've got 6 of them on it, but you've got 60 people saying can't do that, can't do that, can't do that, because you've got to comply with all these government needs. That's just a ratio that needs to be balanced, not the elimination of all safeguards, just a ratio that needs to be balanced. If you're going to do that, then you have to look at that second pillar of reducing procedural bloat. We've got a lot of things that, meant something at one time. They've become overbearing in terms of process. They are probably, in some cases, really no longer relevant. The world has moved on. We're in a digital world, and we need to be much more thoughtful about reducing that bloat so that you can have the proper ratio. So those things really go together, and I think that they also speak to the ways in which I think this agenda really can and should be bipartisan, because whether you think government is too big or too small, I think you can see yourself in these solutions. The digital and data infrastructure, I think, really speaks for itself. We do live in a digital world, and that's a challenge. I guess accepting that is a challenge that I feel like I fought for the first 10 years of my career, where that seemed like sort of an afterthought. It wasn't part of the conception of how you would deliver a service or get an outcome. It was like, that's something other people do. We don't think about that. And it's increasingly clear that the digital and data infrastructure is how we deliver these outcomes, or it's so core to it. We can't just set it aside as a detail of policy implementation. And the last one I think goes with that as well. And I think Andrew spoke to this very well. The idea that we have to close the loop between policy implementation between policy and implementation is just a recognition that we no longer live in a world that is complicated, but a world that is fundamentally complex. And so you often can't know if I do X, will Y happen, because the systems that we're acting on are so complex and adaptive. And in that world, you must say, rather than let me plan very well and hope that when I do X, I will get Y, I'm going to say, let me find ways to test to make sure that if I want Y, X is what I should do. And if not, let me do something different. And that is also, I think, where Andrew's point about these integrated teams, these multidisciplinary teams come together. You cannot find those things out when you're working in silos. So the idea of closing the loop where, let's say, Congress passes a law and then instead of handing it off and sort of never seeing it again until there's a big failure and we have an outrage hearing to question everybody about why it failed, but rather circling back on a frequent basis and saying, is this working? What do we need to do to adjust? And that could be Congress, that could be executive branch, but that sort of iterative returning to the goal kind of framework is just another expression of the fact that we live in a fundamentally different world than we did in the 50s and 60s, where planning very, very thoroughly would get you the outcome that you intended.
And Andrew, because you wrote the Radical How, and I know that y'all were inspired by that paper here, what are your thoughts on these 4 priority areas, and how does that compare to some of the things that you put in the Radical How?
It's very similar, really. I mean, it's fascinating to me how much commonality there is between systems in terms of some of the challenges that they face. I mean, we could have written a very similar report for Canada. We could have written a very similar report for Australia. We could write a sort of similar, but kind of with a slightly different flavor because of the legal frameworks for large parts of Western Europe. So there's a lot of kind of commonality between these things. And like the thing that what Jen was talking around closing the loop, in some ways, that to me feels like the biggest challenge that bureaucracies have to kind of grip. Like they find it feels quite difficult, and the way the incentive structures tend to be set up. I think that lots of places find that really hard, and it is the sort of closing of 2 gaps, as Jen says. It's the closing of the gaps that exist between policy, technology, and implementation, and then the other gap between ideas and reality. And in both cases, they're pretty wide chasms in all sorts of places. And it's not just true geographically or indeed between different levels of government, because, I'm sure federal and state, city all kind of experience this. It's also equally true across domains. So I talked a bit about welfare, but this is just as true in health and tax and justice and defense. And defense I find kind of interesting because when having had discussions with people about agile and waterfall and what Jen was saying about the difference between complex and complicated, I used to say, oh, well, waterfall methodologies are actually they sort of work for defense, right? Because you can specify loads of requirements up front. And I was talking to somebody here, a colleague who worked in that world, and he said, well, quite a lot of the stuff that's involved in building nuclear subs isn't done through a waterfall methodology. So no, this sort of iterative loop is still equally important for things that conventionally you might think are built in controlled environments. And one of the things is psychologically, I think, difficult for people who've maybe been in public service for a lot of their careers and been very successful and reached the senior levels of those structures, is that they've been taught over a long period of time, politicians as well, the way to reduce risk is to do the maximum amount of planning up front. That's how you mitigate the risk of screwing stuff up. We write everything down in risk registers. We plan as exhaustively as possible. We do all the economic modeling we possibly can. And by doing so, we'll kind of mitigate the risk of wasting public money and getting this thing wrong. And that's what happened with universal credit. And the problem was people don't always behave the way that you expect them to. Technologies change quite quickly. The social context moves on pretty fast. And so it's sort of this addiction to false certainty and the incumbent paperwork and bureaucracy that comes with that is a sort of a comfort blanket, because people are following the rules, they're doing what they should be doing, they're following the orthodoxy, they're following the patterns. And the fact that the outcome is not what they wanted is sort of not their fault. Or at least it's like, but we followed all the rules and this happened, so it can't be our fault. And it's interesting that kind of behavior and that psychology, I think, equally impacts not just the public servants, but often the outsourced suppliers who are brought in to follow a kind of set of requirements and deliver against the contract. By and large, they will deliver against the contract, but the outcome that was intended as a result of that contract, nowhere near it. So changing that sense of where risk really lies in the delivery of complex things in complex systems is one of the big shifts that I think will need to be made over the next few years. And if it doesn't, then I think we'll see a lot more wasted money and bad outcomes delivered.
One example of this, speaking to the defense space, is the ships that were delivered, I think it was 2 years ago by the Navy, these literal ships that had been in development for, I want to say 20 years, but someone can check me on that. And by the time they were delivered, there were the normal problems that we hear about, bugs in it. They were returned to, port on their first outing. This is what we're used to hearing about. Like the contractors did a bad job and we've wasted a bunch of money and it's not a good product. And that is certainly due to these very heavyweight procurement processes that take a long time, where, as Andrew says, people are being really careful. They're doing it in the way that for them and for the system, feels like the right careful way to do it. But it wasn't just that they were buggy, right? By the time we got those ships, we literally did not need them anymore. The kind of war that we are now, trying to avert, or the deterrence that we are trying to establish with ships like that in the Navy and other, warfighting platforms is simply different because the world has changed. And I think that's where one of the concepts that we talk about in the book is, or rather in the report, is fighting trade-off denial. When you say this must be done the careful way and all of these safeguards are super, super important, you may be absolutely right, but are they as important as delivering the thing in the time frame that it's actually needed? Because I don't remember the cost of those ships, but that amount of money certainly should have gone to the kinds of either ships or drones or whatever it is that we need to deter our enemies today, not 20 years ago.
So just for the audience, I've got a few more questions for the authors here, but if you've got questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll definitely save some time for there. One thing I'd like to follow up with y'all on is, so in the first three priority areas that you identified, so people, burden, and digital infrastructure, that feels like that can apply pretty consistently no matter what type of political system you have. The fourth one seems to be particularly interesting, and y'all identified some differences between the UK and the US as just one example, but I know that the US could learn from other countries as well, where the political system that we have is going to affect what kind of feedback loop you're actually able to establish, for example, between the legislative and the executive, let alone the things that happen within the executive alone. And so just want to get y'all's impressions on is that what you're seeing? Andrew, you do work all over the world. Is that what you're seeing in terms of like uh, the type of, we've got our Congress, which works a little bit differently than your parliament, but you've seen these examples across. And Jen, I know you've put some ideas forth on how do we create some new feedback loops between the executive and legislative in a way that we can update policy that the UK can do maybe more easily. So Andrew, maybe just give your impressions, and Jen, you could chime in on that too.
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, so for the benefit of the tape, the UK sort of has a slight advantage in terms of creating those feedback loops, in that we have sort of primary and secondary legislation. And in legislation, secondary legislation is sort of relatively minor tweaks within the kind of scope of a wider bill. So that allows for more technical changes that don't require full debate and kind of going back to Parliament and so on. There's a bit more flexibility. And that gets used a lot. So that in some ways makes our legal environment more flexible to change. That doesn't mean it's necessarily effectively used as such, although it was in the case of universal credit. So I mentioned in the very early days of that reset, the team tested their sort of new prototype with 100 households. We needed to change a small piece of law to make that possible, but that was relatively doable because of that flexibility. So I think that's a genuine advantage, and that legal framework clearly varies quite a lot across different countries, and the separation of powers does make that different in the US. The thing I'd say, though, I think around the sort of the legalities, if you like, of legislation and so on, is that it more often than not, when you really scratch the surface of trying to do things, it was so often the interpretation of the laws and the legal framework, rather than the actuality of it, rather than the sort of hard lines that are drawn, that was the thing that was impacting and blocking people. And it was a sort of a naturally kind of risk averse, cautious interpretation of some of those rules and legal frameworks, rather than not being permitted to do those things by law. So our kind of politician who was in charge of the government digital service, a guy called Francis Maud, he got into the habit of asking his public servants to literally show him the law that says he cannot do this. Because there was lots of, as you can imagine, with the digital team at that day, there was lots of sort of services we wanted to change where people would tell us, oh no, but you need to sign this form with ink, so you can't put that online. And Francis would say, do you really? Can you show me the kind of legislation that says that? And more often than not, it didn't really exist. It was an interpretation of those existing rules. So I think for teams who are trying to kind of navigate that and encounter that as a blocker, there will be real kind of legal blockages there without question. But more often than not, it's a case of interpretation than the rules, certainly in certain circumstances.
I'm taking the liberty of sharing screen for a second. I hope that works. Do you guys see the cascade of rigidity?
Yeah.
We did a lot on diagrams in this report. So for those of you who are visual learners, I hope you enjoy them. But this is related to what Andrew was saying, and I think a really helpful way of thinking about change to make sure you know where in this cascade from law and policy to sort of what you're told, like what Francis Ma was told, where you are and where you might dig out of it by sort of pulling back and saying, is this really the law that I can't do this? Or is this an interpretation of the law that has been made in a sort of maximalist way and could be made with a little bit more or frankly, plenty more flexibility and still be very, very legal and get to the outcomes that the law actually intends. And I'll stop sharing screen now.
That's great. So before we get to Q&A, I'd like to ask y'all one question. Maybe Jen, I'll start with you. So what's the way forward? It's early 2025. What's the plan? How are we going to start addressing these 4 areas? Like, how are you seeing this play out?
So state capacity is obviously a very broad concept. And in our particular system of government, it applies across 3 branches. We really just deal with 2 of them, and across our wacky system of federalism. So federal, state, and local. It also, I think, is relevant across parties. So you have these multiple dimensions. And basically, the way I think about it in this moment, really any moment, but maybe particularly this moment, is we're going to have to figure out how to make this real wherever we can. So on our last pillar, for instance, closing the loop between policy and implementation. That's going to require engagement from law and policy makers. And not everybody wants to do that. They're very busy with other things. They have different priorities. Maybe the what is much more important to them than the how right now. But we have one Congress. We have 50 state legislatures. We've got 30,000 city halls. We've got lots of different places where we can show what we mean by this. Because it's not just a matter of saying, here's a framework that exists that you can adopt. It's, like agile software development, for instance, like pretty well known, like people know how to do this. There's like lots of artifacts that will help you, scaffold your teams and train them how to do it. When you're talking about things like closing the loop, and moving from a profoundly waterfall system, of how we think and how we operate in government to a more iterative one, you're going to have to be making it up. You're going to have to be pioneering this. And so we're going to pioneer it, I think, wherever we can, and then raise up those stories and say, if there's a state, for instance, that's looking at a program that they don't want to talk about yet. We could talk about it soon, but we're trying to create incentives for legislators, not to just pass new laws, but to do very thoughtful follow-up on previous initiatives and laws and priorities that matter to that state, and sort of shift their focus from more what, which has not really been effective, frankly, to a lot more how. And, if we can say, if that state can do it, then this other state can do it, and the city hall can do it, and maybe Congress can do it. I think that's the way we win on this, is finding where we can have the wins and spreading them. And you mentioned storytelling. I think we've got to be really good at bringing this to life instead of just making it. And I love our diagrams in the paper, I really do. But those don't mean anything until you can tell a story about how a state or a city or, a legislator is getting better outcomes for people that they can actually really feel and see and matter to them because they did something differently.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add on top of that. I mean, just to sort of double click on that point, which is you can't, as much as we've written a report about it, you can't win this argument on paper. You have to show people the difference. And I mean, people as in citizens, the government needs to feel easier to them. I remember that in GDS, we made a video once of a service called lasting power of attorney. So how you kind of give power sort of to your children or something, just in case you're incapacitated and can't give out the wishes of your will or something like that. We made that an online service, and we did a video of a woman who'd been through the new service and really enjoyed it, and like it made people cry. In the sense of this thing became so much easier. It lifted a burden from her, that's something that she was worried about. So there's a really intense humanity to public services and delivery of some of these things, and kind of conveying that is incredibly important in creating, as kind of Jen said, that tangible change in outcomes. Because this is what this is all about. This isn't about having a better argument or a cleverer argument. We can't clever our way to getting better at this. It's about kind of really showing the difference to people and for people. And the governments that tend to have made the most progress in this direction have used sort of beacons or demonstrator projects. Someone mentioned direct file in the chat. There are things like that. I'm aware that's a sort of relatively hot topic at the moment. But there are teams in government right now who are working in this way, and telling their stories and giving them space and protection to do their thing is a big part of getting this to land.
Yeah, direct file is a great example because I think had it not been so successful as a product, it would have gotten killed for political reasons. But it has got its own momentum now, and that you got to show it. It's got to be live. It's got to be real.
Well, thank you both. We're going to turn to some questions, but I'm going to drop in the chat again the Google form because we are not possibly going to be able to get through all the questions and the great discussion. So this is an opportunity for y'all to share some of your thoughts so we can follow up with you. So please fill that out if you've got additional questions and ideas for us. But we'll turn to some of the questions. So there's been a couple questions around procurement and outsourcing the role of contractors. So some of the state capacity issues outsourcing. Is there a clear role that the private sector should play in building state capacity that is different from the current outsourcing and procurement model?
The take we have on this in the paper starts with what does the state need to do, or the administrative state, what does government need to do differently in order to enable the private sector to do this better? And one of the dysfunctions we talk about is that we've sort of outsourced our navigation. We've put, not that we don't need outsourcing, we don't need contractors, but if we don't know what we're contracting for, if we don't know what the product is supposed to look like, if we sort of infantilized ourselves by giving everything over to contractors, you simply cannot get the outcomes that we need. So I'll let Andrew speak to this a little bit more because they've had such success in this, or maybe some steps forward, some steps back, but in the UK. But I really think that this comes down to questioning again, what is it that is truly inherently governmental? That's a concept that I think dates back to the 60s, where OMB tried to sort of delineate like what is appropriate to go outside and what needs to be inside, like in-house. And I think that line has changed over time as we moved into a digital world. And it's also changed as we've sort of created this dependency on contractors. I think we can fix that simply by having relatively modest investments in internal capacity, in digital, in understanding our programs, in policy expertise, in the muscles of that build, measure, learn cycle that we're talking about, right? We just have to be able to do that, and then we can outsource well. But we're not going to be able to do that if we don't sort of question, I think, the what has been current thinking, basically, I would say, on the left and the right. And I will say, there's other questions in the chat about Doge, which are very complicated and probably very high emotion at this moment. But one of the things we know Doge has said when they came in, or these Doge teams have said when they came in and looked at how agencies operate is, wow, they really don't generally have the internal capabilities that we would expect. How would we build that? And I think that's a valuable question to ask, which I would separate from a lot of the other. It's a question. It's a good question to ask, and let me separate it from who's asking it for a moment.
Yeah, completely. I mean, like, it's an important interest to declare. I'm a consultant. We do work with governments, like, and
Right.
and the way we do work with governments is that we do stuff with them, right, not for them. Like the idea is we kind of deliver a team that can kind of get on and do stuff without us, because that's sort of, that's kind of where we've come from. I mean, I talked a lot about universal credit this morning, but there's various other programs that have worked really well in the UK and other places with kind of contractors or kind of external consultants and supporters. But what they've done is, rather than go, here's a list of stuff we want, go away and do it. Well, we might check in occasionally as to whether you've kind of ticked the boxes. Those people have come together in blended teams in the same room. So when you go into the room with the kind of the team that's building whatever kind of new service it happens to be, you don't know who's an in-house employee or who's a contractor or who's a consultant. They're on the same team in the same room delivering the same outcome. And again, I suppose it's another one of those gaps that we were talking about before, that when you have that kind of very transactional contractual relationship, you just end up managing to the piece of paper and you lose sight of the outcome. And I think that's quite a lot of the sort of the bigger outsourcing failures, certainly that we've had in the UK, and I know in parts of Canada and elsewhere, have fallen over. So there's no question there's a role between public and private, and indeed kind of other parts of civic society as well. But the way it's kind of balkanized and split out at the moment is not leading to that relationship being terribly effective in most places.
Okay, well, those are great answers. We can't dodge the Doge. So Jen, you mentioned this a little bit. This is clearly moving very quickly. There's updates every day on what's happening, what's not happening, and trying to get to the bottom of it. But I would just appreciate y'all's perspective on this. I think General Shanahan, I see your note in the quote, so thanks for joining us. Uh, Maybe some reasons for optimism. So obviously, you might have some different opinions on how they're going about doing things and where they're doing that and when. But just share a little bit about some high level impressions that you feel at the moment, and then maybe some points for optimism.
I'll start with just echoing the concerns that I hear and reframing them in our particular way we've sort of trying to put these questions. There's reporting today that that the Doge team did intend or is trying to actually stop payments in that system rather than fix the system. I don't know. I'm not a reporter. I am not there. I don't know if that's true. I'm sorry. And backing up, this is about Doge having access to the Treasury payments, Treasury's, government-wide payment system. If that's true, they've really breached the wall between when and how here. If they are there to look at a system that could use improvements, that could be made better at catching fraud and faster and cheaper at delivering payments to the American public per the programs that have been defined by Congress, then I'm all for them. If they're there to stop something that was democratically decided upon, that our Congress said needed to happen, that we would make these payments of their own accord, then that is a completely different territory from fixing the how of government. And I'm hoping that in the coming weeks, that kind of activity or questions about that activity will subside, and we can get back to a very important discussion of how to improve our technology systems and the questions that haven't been asked that can be asked in these days. Right now, though, they're being overshadowed by a serious breach of trust, and that, if true, really is in a very inappropriate way to come in to this question of improving government systems.
Yeah, I mean, I'm conscious that I'm the house guest here, so I will be careful not to cause diplomatic incident. But I mean, it's pretty unsettling to watch, right? And it's worth saying that these people are smart. Like they've gone towards the levers that you would be drawn to if you did want to drive change, I think. And that, understandably is pretty worrying if you disagree strongly with what they are trying to do, but they have been paying attention to how to change bureaucracy. So that is certainly one thing. And I mean, sort of reflecting a bit on it, they've sort of hit on something that I think should have been plain to a lot more people, which is if you want change in government, you have to take the levers of state capacity seriously. Like civil service reform is a first order political issue and has not been treated as such by people who are perhaps more inclined to make a positive case for the state. Um, and that's bad. And I think there's probably a period of self-reflection because this field has been left relatively open to those who may take a more destructive view of that. So I mean, I really do think that this discussion is even more important perhaps than or certainly more pointed than it has been for a very long time. And it perhaps also speaks to quite an interesting trend that I think is certainly kind of feels like it's been gently accelerating for the last 10 years or so, which is, this sort of slight shift in power of influence from the kind of the traditional worlds and mindsets of policy and diplomacy to those of digital data and technology. And this is sort of manifested in a kind of breaking through the window moment. But this is not new. This has been kind of happening kind of by degrees and at the edges and in the shadows, I think, for a little while in the US, but also in the UK and elsewhere. And I don't think that genie is going back in the bottle. And I think that sort of demands quite a lot of reflection from folks who maybe are more naturally inclined to the kind of the typical policy discourse that tends to dominate places like the Hill and Westminster, and there's some catching up to do. So I think if nothing else, the last few weeks have brought that into very sharp focus and hopefully will kind of give a bit of reflection.
If we have time for one more question, I think that Andrew's really good on this. Sean Mahoney asks, if the current incentive is to ensure full compliance with regulations, how can that be changed without causing a reaction back to reliance on process? This is just typical of the kind of questions I think we get a lot, and I do think that there's just need for more support and advice. And I know we're running out of time, but maybe Andrew, you could speak to it really briefly.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm just trying to spot the question. Create insight, align incentives, people trying to bring. Well, okay. So, I mean, there's one kind of, given I've only got sort of 60 seconds, the sort of the thing that changed this most significantly that I've seen within the government machine, fundamentally, it comes down to leadership. And an enormous amount of the sort of successful examples I've seen have been led by a people or a small group of people who have provided an umbrella over the top of a team from some of the kind of the compliance and kind of those sort of things in front of them. And they have effectively kind of created a set of incentives for the people below them, which is be responsible, but be bold. And we will kind of give you the cover and protection to do the things that you're best at and get that done when the inevitable antibodies kind of come at you. And at the same time, those sort of leaders tend to be playing almost a kind of, it's a slight jargon, but a servant leadership role back into the organization, which is saying the overall operating environment that you're creating for my team, which by the way is clearly moving the needle more on outcomes than most of the rest of this organization, they are being stymied by what you're doing, not with great intent, but on terms of the governance and the steering boards and the documents you're asking them to fill in, the way that they buy stuff, the way that they hire people, and kind of be that advocate back into the enabling functions of the organization. And that form of leadership, I think, is one of the things that will actually kind of drive this through. And it's difficult because being that kind of leader is pretty lonely. That's pretty hard. You're kind of getting it from all angles. You're getting it from the team who are going, oh, but these people are just such a pain in the ass. And you're getting it from above, which is like, I don't understand what they're doing. They're doing it differently. It seems risky and weird. We don't like it. But a leader can, I think, temporarily create the conditions and incentives for teams to work in different ways and get great stuff done. The reason why I think so often the good stuff is exceptional is that you can only do that so for long as an individual. It's lonely, it's hard, the resilience required to get through that's pretty tough. And people burn out, flame out, or leave. So looking at some of those, and there will be those people all over the states, federal, state, city, there will be those leaders in the system. Finding them, listening to them, and giving them the space to be them, I think will be the single biggest catalyst to doing more of this stuff well.
David Jones pulled out the same quote I was thinking of, which is be responsible and be bold. And I think I would just end by saying that it's not a zero-sum game. We can be responsible by being more bold. And I hope that that's comes across in the report.
Well, thank you both, Jen, Andrew. Thank you for today. Thank you for writing the report. Thank you for all the work you're going to continue to put into it. All the attendees, really appreciate y'all jumping in the chat and the Q&A. We will review these. There's clearly a lot of energy here. Could not hit everything. So stand by and we'll continue to try to create some opportunities for some meaningful engagement on these issues. So thank you very much, and we'll stay in touch.